time today to talk about concern trolling and its relationship to political conservatism and its YouTube counterpart, shitlordism. Now, I guess the easiest way to start this is to use something that popped into my mind when trying to process the substance of concern trolling. The Simpsons had a running gag of every time there was a crisis in town, the Reverend's wife would cry out, "What about the children?" That was meant to reference the propensity of the American conservative movement at the time that was dominated by evangelical Christians, their tendency to concern troll, which was to take any kind of crisis or problem and turn it into a crisis by attaching a bunch of embellished concern for how things were going to affect the family, affect children. You know, so when we're talking about adults getting gay married, or depictions, platonic, wholesome depictions of homosexuality in media, at the time, the evangelical Christians would pop up with, how am I going to explain this to my kids? What kind of example is this? And, they would use this slogan of, Katie has two mommies sort of thing of, depriving adults of agency using embellished and cynical concern. This has been used almost to the point of exhaustion, whether it's on social issues, economic issues, where conservatives will use slogans in order to give tax cuts to the rich. They'll feign concern for small business owners. What about small businesses? To me, I would label concern trolling more specifically as opportunistic empathy. Conservatism, including its latest iteration on YouTube, which is shitlordism, and you'll say, "Oh, the majority of shitlords are left of center," blah blah blah. The shitlords are basically a form of conservatism that starts from a base that is somewhat liberal, meaning that at this point, gay marriage is normalized. And other social issues like trans rights have become more mainstream. So now the marginalized group that you have to stand up for within the trans movement, in a more, radical way, is non-binary people, right? So people make statements about non-binary people that they used to make about binary trans people. This kind of idea of, they're either mentally ill, or they're faking, or they're not really trans. Back in the day, cis, het people, gay and straight, would marginalize trans people in kind of the same way of, they have a mental illness. I think Blair White still does this. I think that a lot of the people from like the Bearing Jeff Holiday and the shitlord spectrum do kind of, hang their hat on the idea that the legitimacy of transgenderism is premised on sort of this DSM manual definition of gender dysphoria as a mental illness. I digress. So the shitlords are conservatives. They're just conserving a relatively liberal paradigm. I'm just using transgenderism as an example of how somebody can be conservative in the face of something that seems liberal to mainstream conservatives. The political spectrum on YouTube is skewed. So, recently, Jeff Holiday popped up his head on Twitter to basically make a statement that the YouTuber Ted Sheeris, who's been here for a long time, Ted Sheeris has been on YouTube virtually since the site's inception, making videos. There was an argument on Twitter, and it's been ongoing for a few days now, that, the shitlords basically said that Sheeris was indoctrinated, brainwashed, that the social justice feminist movement was exploiting the fact that Ted Sheeris has CP, he has cerebral palsy, and that we were brainwashing this disabled person to parrot social justice talking points. So that connects to this kind of concern trolling thing, which is, I care about victimization, opportunistic empathy. My heart bleeds, but only for people to whom it is, people on my own team's benefit. So I'll give you another example, right, of opportunistic empathy. Sargon of Akkad criticizes social justice warriors for being bleeding heart liberals and talking about racism against non-whites, and then he will go on to cry out in horrible agony as he is, his empathy for white victims of reverse racism sends him to the internet foaming at the mouth. Opportunistic empathy. He doesn't feel any empathy for black victims of white racism, but conveniently he feels compassion for the real victims of racism, white people who are being criticized by BuzzFeed and MTV. So it's selective compassion. Selective compassion. The big criticism of the SJWs by the shitlord community is that, and by conservatism at large, that we're bleeding hearts. That we feel sympathy for people who don't deserve it. You can even see this. You can even see this on the macro level with Donald Trump founding this government agency to make records for victims of immigrant crime. This voice initiative that he talked about. Donald Trump doesn't give a fuck about victims of crime until it benefits his political narrative. His political narrative about black criminality, bam. He cares about victims of black-on-black crime in Chicago. His narrative about, Mexican rapists and Islamo rape gangs. Now he cares about the victims of immigrant crime not being heard. The Sargon of Akkad's real victims narrative, which is very, very old. Very, very old conservative talking point, that the real victims of racism are, number one, white people at large, and number two, black conservatives. That's their other big one, is that, black people who endorse conservative values are somehow subject to the only real racism. I think Ann Coulter actually went on with that the people that really endure racism are people like Clarence Thomas. So, I would implore the people watching this video to consider the fact that empathy is not an absolute good, that empathy and compassion are not exactly the same thing, that compassion is one removed from empathy, meaning that empathy is feeling someone else's pain and following them down into their pain. Compassion is understanding someone's pain and being there for them without necessarily experiencing their pain with them. And I mean that's why so many people, I think, get defeated by conservative talking points, is that their empathy gets exploited. Because what about the children?